Hello everyone, I'm Don Moyer from Moyer Marine. In our winter newsletter of 2017, we went into considerable detail to explain how it is that the induction process can come up with upwards of 20,000 volts from what is essentially a 12-volt DC system. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate a functional check of a coil where the induction process actually takes place. So to keep things as simple as possible, we reduced our training aids to the minimum required to get a good secondary discharge from the top post of the coil. We anguished over whether or not to use this old engine block as a mounting place for the coil out of a concern that you might feel that the coil has to be in some way grounded to the block, which is not the case. In fact, the primary and secondary windings within the coil are insulated from each other as well as from the can of the coil. So while it may appear that the coil is grounded to the block, it really isn't in any way. We'll of course need a 12-volt power supply, and we have the positive post of this battery connected to the big battery terminal on the back of the starter solenoid, just like it is on your boat. This terminal serves as a convenient place for us to connect this small jumper cable to supply power to the positive terminal of the coil. Remember that connecting this jumper wire is the same thing as turning on your ignition switch in the cockpit. So in a real troubleshooting scenario, be careful not to leave this wire connected indefinitely. Use it only when you're actually trying to start the engine or troubleshoot for ignition. So in order to complete the circuit through the primary windings of the coil, we'll need a second jumper wire to make that connection to some convenient spot on the head. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm using an ice pick simply to be a little bit more articulate and sharp in my making and breaking of the circuit. This, by the way, is exactly what the points do in a conventional system or electronic module will be doing in an electronic ignition system. But please don't confuse these sparks with a secondary discharge from the coil. These are simply a result of a 12-volt circuit opening and closing. The last item to show you from our test setup is this second grounding wire we have made up, which includes a condenser. Now, most of you have been told many times that the condenser's role is to provide an alternate path to ground around the points to minimize the arcing and make for a stronger secondary discharge. The problem is, in a regular setup in the distributor, it's very difficult for most of us to follow the electrical pathway through the condenser to ground. So for this, when we get around to making the secondary arc in this demonstration, we'll be using the condenser in this jumper wire, with the condenser being out in plain view. Before moving ahead, we have removed the small jumper wires from the primary terminals of the coil so we can make a few important static checks to show the condition of the coil. Each end of the primary windings within the coil connect to the small primary terminals on top of the coil. One end of the secondary windings also connects to the negative terminal of the coil, but the other end connects to the positive post on top of the coil, which is where the secondary discharge will emanate from. The secondary windings are very fine, so there'll be lots of resistance in the secondary coil. typically 9 to 11,000 ohms. This secondary coil is showing right at 10,000 ohms, which is right in the middle of the recommended range. The primary windings are much coarser, and so the resistance is very much lighter, typically in the 3.5 to 4 ohms. This coil is showing right at 3.9 ohms. So this coil should be capable of producing a good secondary discharge for us. Now, in addition to these simple static checks, check the body of the coil for any major mechanical damage or dents, deep rusty pittings, or most importantly, any evidence of oil leaking from the jacket. Any of those things would be reason for taking the coil out of service. So all that remains to be done now is what we came here to do in the first place, which is to create a good secondary arc from this coil to ground. Notice that we have already connected the jumper wire from the positive of the coil to the battery terminal on the back of the starter solenoid. And we have the second jumper wire ready to go to duplicate the action of the points in completing the primary circuit to ground. And as we do that, we can see that we have a small secondary arc, very unimpressive at this point because we haven't yet added the condenser to the mix. So let's do that now. Remember, the condenser just is wired across the points, this representing the points, from there to ground. Now let's see what the secondary discharge looks like. There it is. We have a good 1/2 inch and moving it out to closer to 3/4 of an inch. How's that for fast-moving electrons? In summary, this is exactly the kind of test that I lead many of you through each year during telephone troubleshooting scenarios. The real value of the test is that it separates the coil from a host of other potential problems in the ignition system, more commonly a loose connection somewhere in the primary circuit leading from the engine to the cockpit and back, or something as simple as perhaps bad spark plugs. But in any case, you have positively ruled out your coil as being any part of your problem. Thank you for your time, and keep up the good work.